Afternoon, and welcome to the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce's Economic Conference in conjunction with the Brazil-U.S. Business Council in Washington. I am John Welch, Executive Director of the Brazilian American Chamber, and on behalf of the Chamber, we wish you all health and safety during this still difficult time.
So good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are well and healthy. Welcome to our 2021 Brazil Economic Conference in partnership with the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce in New York. As John said, for years, the Economic Conference, held on the margins of the IMF fall meetings that take place next week, convenes the stakeholders and the business community and authorities for in-depth conversation on Brazil's economic and political outlook and investment trends and opportunities.
In anticipation of the recovery of non-tradable goods and services, the Banco Central has been tightening. There's a huge array of opinions of whether it's tightening enough or too much, but maybe some of the data will show us some of the things there. Fiscal accounts have improved significantly more than even optimistic forecasts had. And we've seen net of interest surpluses, that is the primary surplus, in many months over the last 12 months, which is really quite surprising. Net debt and gross debt to GDP ratios have declined recently, and it looked like they're stabilizing, which is also a bit of a surprise. I like to look at is excess mortality to gauge this is going. This is the mortality over and above what is normal for this time of year. And this comes from Oxford University. And it shows you the mortality relative to the average of the last 10 years. And you can see Brazil has been on decline also from late February, early March. It's still high, it's still above normal rates. And the United States has picked up, as well as the United Kingdom, because of the Delta variant. And I was expecting Colombia to come down. You can see that excess mortality in Brazil has come down quite a bit in recent months. So it's very clear that Brazil is, at least for now, getting COVID-19 and its variants under control. Let's talk about vaccinations. And here's the latest from Oxford also. You can see that Brazil has 71%, with at least one vaccination, above the United States, above Germany, not as good as Portugal, Chile, et cetera, but still pretty good vaccination rate. They caught up, as did Canada and a couple others there who were late, but the vaccination side is in pretty good shape at this point, and it's getting better, and the daily rate is very high. We've had a big improvement from the lows of the pandemic. You can see the primary balance, which is the one that doesn't include interest, it's surprised even the more optimistic, such as myself, in how fast it's come back. And we are now it's a minus just a little bit more than 2%. And we've seen the nominal deficit come back. The green line is the private sector Social Security deficit, which was improving. We've had a little bit of a dip in the last 2 months. It probably has something to do with Social Security reform, but also it has to do with the economic recovery. So hard to tell on that front. But really, on the flow side, the fiscal accounts are doing much better than most countries, and certainly better than what most people expected. Because of that, the debt to GDP ratio has kind of stabilized, and it's well below what we were hearing forecasts of, above 100%. So even the gross debt to GDP, which doesn't discount assets like foreign exchange reserves, is 83, 84% of GDP, and there was projections of well above 100%. Our first panel is going to be moderated by the Chamber Director and friend and old colleague, Paulo Vieira da Cunha of Verbank Consulting. He produced and managed research for global securities firms in New York, and previously held managerial, operational, and research positions at the World Bank, the Central Bank of Brazil, the IMF, the Brazilian government, research institutes, and universities.
Hi everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome, and thank you, John. Thank you for this presentation. The average growth rate in the last 10 years, that's excluding the COVID 2020, was 1.5% per annum. In the last 20 years, it was 2.5%. And the estimated medium-term potential GDP today is 2% or less. Many things influence this disappointing performance. One is for certain, the interaction between the fiscal regime and growth. And the fiscal challenges remain paramount.
Thank you, Paulo, for the very kind introduction. Thank you, John, for the invitation to be here. Thank you all for being with us. Precatório, these are the court decisions against the government. Sometimes we refer to these things as skeletons. That's the technical language for them. In the past, former Minister of Finance, Pedro Malan, has issued a statement about that. That is a classic. That is, in Brazil, not only the future, but also the past is uncertain. So large was the amount of surprises that the past will bring us in the form of skeletons. That is the recognition of old debts, let them be by virtue of court decisions or by other mechanisms. And in most cases in the 90s, we had to engineer specific laws to securitize and recognize problems in the navigation system or the public banks or whatever, independent from court decisions. It so happens that now the issue of court decisions have become like a multitude of small skeletons, baby skeletons, which, however, summed together, come to something significant. This year, it was something like 50 billion order of magnitude, and expectation for 2022 budget would be something like 90 billion. It makes a difference. One could argue, well, perhaps not so much in a 1.6 trillion budget. That is the size of yearly Brazilian fiscal budget. But see, and that begs the question, why should we be worrying about court decisions in Brazil? Is this a macroeconomic topic after all? And the question, it's pretty complex, has to do with the nature of this. You could say, like you said, Paulo, that is debt. Ultimately, it's the recognition that the government owns some money to somebody, right? Bought something for which it didn't pay. It has to pay now. And whether or not it belongs to primary spending, it will be, a topic for accounting doctoral dissertations, not a policy topic, except for the fact that the constitutional amendment establishing a cap on primary spending has been, for the last few years and for the near future, the great fiscal anchor on which the whole policy idea in Brazil is predicated. So the ceiling has been the big fiscal tool and brought a few years back to put our fiscal house in order. And it is a bit like balanced budget constitutional amendments that have been done in other countries. In the US, we had that in the 90s. Lots of problems with that kind of constitutional amendment because it makes the budget a constitutional thing, pretty rigid, hard to make it flexible in response to things that change in the economy one year to the next. And we passed that ceiling a few years back in the hope that we would also pass the constitutional amendment changing the Social Security in Brazil in order to give more fiscal space, as we say, below the ceiling. So far, the ceiling has not been binding yet for budgets year by year. We're coming close to that. And the big thing about the court decisions bill is that it consumes that space, that slack below the ceiling that government intends to use for other purposes, mostly a new relief program, which is bound to have big electoral impact. The intention is to replace the famous Bolsa Familia program for a more ambitious, larger program, paying a larger benefit and reaching more people.
Thank you, Paul. What has been said here, first by John, then by you and by Gustavo, certainly creates a nice background for what I want to say. We have tried to improve the tax structure for many, many years without success. Indeed, where are these problems located? They are not on the taxation of income, mostly. There are problems there, of course, but they are not so dramatic, so decisive. There are the problem with the taxation on transactions, on consumption, where you find a large number of taxes that belong to the three levels of government, and they are dysfunctional and create costs that are not passed through consumers, and therefore they impinge on competitiveness, they slow down production, and they make it difficult to export. And competitiveness is not only the ability to export goods, but also to compete in the domestic markets with imports. The major problem, it looks like, is the fact that Brazil is a large country, is a federation, it's quite a decentralized state, in which where each level of government has its own taxing capacity, its own taxes. And that's important that these taxes be coordinated among these governments. What also makes it difficult is the fact that the capacity to tax sales belong to state governments. They are not centralized as other federations like Germany, like Australia. They are like in the United States, like in Canada, like in India. The previous attempt to solve this problem have not succeeded, mostly because the states saw this as a problem of the federal government. Federal government should promote the reform and should compensate the loss of a state would have, because of course, if you make a more rational tax design, some state would lose revenue, some state would gain. Even if it's a zero-sum game, you have losers. And those used to form a blocking coalition against reform. They demanded that the federal government would compensate them for these potential losses. And this was a non-starter because federal government simply didn't have the means to do that. Now, believe it or not, this has been left behind. The states now are accommodated. They joined a common proposal to make this tax reform. So this is completely new, and it has happened this year for the first time. And the proposal that has been presented 2 days ago in Parliament, in the Senate, to change the Constitution, goes a long way to address these problems.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here with you all again. The chamber is like a home for me with my uncle John there, so things are fine. Basically, over the past 20 years, we had a rearrangement of the powers in Brazil. So the mensalão and the car wash scandal, they basically, which was an exposition of power from the judiciary system, helped whether without looking at the details, whether it was good or bad, fair or not, but it created a sort of reorganization in the relationship among the powers. So the judiciary system today in Brazil is much stronger than what it was 20 years ago. As we have seen in the past years, for example, and even months, several questions have been decided in the judiciary in which traditionally they were not many years ago, involving the precatórios, court-ordered payments, fiscal fees, the end of financing of campaign sponsoring from companies, the confirmation of the autonomy of the president of the central bank. So we have seen the judiciary system involved into certain matters that traditionally in the past we have not seen. Also, the legislative gained a lot of power in relation to the executive, mainly in the control of the budget. So before, what we had was that the executive would divide and distribute the budget according to its own agenda. And this was a very powerful tool because this created a very large condition and benefit for a party or an individual to choose to be part of the allied base. Since 2015, the legislative has the power to impose its budget, its amendments, which have also changed the equilibrium of power from the legislative to the executive. In 2023, independent of who will be the Brazilian president, whether it's Bolsonaro, whether it's Lula, whether it's someone else, I still believe that the reformist cycle will remain because it's becoming more and more natural to the larger coalitions in Congress, which tend to remain around 60 to 70%, to seek a reformist mindset and reformist cycle. Of course, we won't have large bundles of reforms as it's expected by the market and the private sector. But what we're going to see is that amidst all the negotiations for tax reform, for administrative reform, and who knows, hopefully one day a political reform, we will see important bits of those reforms moving forward. Okay, constitutional reforms such as these, they will keep on the agenda, and others will become part of the agenda, such as the Federalist Pact and other things. There are at least 10 very important issues that can be integrated or not to specific reformist agendas and targets that are to be voted in the Congress right now. And this demonstrates a larger interaction of the legislative towards the executive, but also it shows how the legislative has increased its power to dictate the rhythm. And one of the key examples is that the power of the legislative in relation to the executive has become such that the Minister of the Civil House is a representative as an ambassador of the Congress instead of the previous configuration that we had of someone from the trust of the president developing the relationship with Congress. Now we have a extended position of the Congress inside the executive with the figure of the Minister of the Civil House. So among those topics, I would say that the environmental licensing is something very interesting and important that is being debated. The cabotaging law, which is basically the naval transportation issue, which is also very important. Infrastructure debentures, the Marco Cambial, all of those, they have some sort of reformist agenda. Another point that it's very important for us to look within the political economic environment is the political impact of the autonomy of the central bank. And this political impact, which again corroborates the strength of the Congress because it was approved there, and also the influence of the judiciary, which validated the independence of the president of the central bank. This gave for the Brazilian monetary authority an independence that we haven't seen in the past mainly in relation to hold back conjectural turbulences, such as the elections and everything that can emerge from the elections based on the heated narratives that can come and will come from the both sides. So basically, the central bank, under this new independence framework, will have an extra strength to deal with the volatility of the electoral campaign, to the point that whoever wins, if it's Bolsonaro, Lula, or someone else, they will have to deal with this president of the central bank in order to be able to integrate better their narrative. And this is something extremely powerful to our monetary policies, but also it demonstrates furthermore that the executive does not have that centrality of decision making, to the point that the executive have to become better at identifying convergence through the narrative and not divergence or convergence through pressure. The fourth point that I want to make is that the September 7th situation that we've seen in Brazil can be evaluated and analyzed through several angles. But one of the most important angles that perhaps a large portion of the press has not given enough attention was that it demonstrated how Brazilian institutions are strong. And one of the major points of confusion when I talk to the financial market here in New York, in Washington, in London, etc., is mixing up the political instability to the institutional instability, to the point in which they believe that the political instability is institutional instability and vice versa. So this is something that the September 7th events, although they were very negative and harmful politically, they demonstrated that institutionally Brazil is solid, because hardly we will have an institutional rupture in Brazil, and there is no strength from any particular segment of the powers to cause or to establish an institutional rupture or an institutional demolition. And the judiciary showed to be very strong in this sense, in which we see from the change of narrative from the president days after Minister Fux showed him a yellow card with high tones of orange, almost in a darker color, in order to calm down all the aggressions that were made towards the judiciary during the September 7th. So what does this explain to us? That Brazil, not only in its society, but within its institutional structure, is a multipolar society in which no one bosses around in Brazil. No one owns Brazil. There is no institution, there is no individual, there is no particular group of individual that owns Brazil. So who, we could ask, is the big boss in the country? Of course, the expectation of society, because of its personalistic perception, is that the president is the leader, as the perception of several members of the financial market in Brazil is of over expectation on top of the figure of Paulo Guedes, because of the personalistic approach of our society, in which an individual, he has the choice to change A to B or yes to no, when they disregard, because of lack of knowledge, the value and the strength of the institutions. So there are several sectors that are owners of Brazil, but they don't appear to be owners. There are several areas and individuals that appear to be owners, but in fact, they do not have the power to do so. So this is something that it's very complex for understanding, in which the general analysis is trying to find where the flaw is, or where the mistake is, or who is the one that committed the mistake in relation to a particular policy or a particular movement.
I ask that we wrap up, Paulo.
Okay, so let's wrap up. John, do you want to close us out, please?
I just want
And
to
thank you again, everyone.
That was a real pleasure. Thank you all for joining us, and I'll turn it over to Cassia now.